All right, go ahead and give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Awesome, perfect. All right. So when we're faced with emergency situations, we're often supposed to take care of ourselves before we can take care of others. When we ride on a plane, for example, in the event of an emergency, you're told to put on your own oxygen mask before you put on the oxygen mask of the child next to you. That's because you can't help anyone else when you're struggling to breathe. It's because the nations of Europe are struggling to breathe right now, and they're attempting to help all the other nations. And I agree that Europe should impose harder restrictions on immigration. Now, let's set up a test for this resolution to kind of decide how we should vote. And that test is responsibility to citizens. When countries are deciding what they should and should not do, the first and foremost priority they must have is a responsibility to their current citizens. If that wasn't true, then they wouldn't have countries at all. Now, with that in mind, I have one main argument with two subpoints under it. And that argument is that Europe is failing its citizens. And we'll look at this through the lens of immigration policy, specifically in two main areas. We'll examine the economic failure as well as the crime increases because of unrestricted immigration into Europe. But before we do that, let's take a look at kind of the current issues that are happening right now in the status quo and just see how many immigrants are truly coming in. Now, according to the BBC, 1.7 million immigrants have entered Europe from 2015 to 2016, and that number is only going to increase. German Development Minister Mueller added that only 10% of those currently on the move have reached Europe, and that 8 to 10 million migrants are still on the way. More and more immigrants are coming in, and this comes at a huge economic cost, which leads me to the first point here, which if you're taking notes, you can write down as economic migrants. When we think of immigrants, we think of refugees, we often think of dying children, we think of people who are hurting and in trouble. Yet that's not where the majority of immigrants are coming from. According to the Gatestone Institute, the migrants arriving in Europe, quote, are overwhelmingly economic migrants seeking a better life in Europe. Only a very small number appear to be legitimate asylum seekers or refugees fleeing war zones. So the majority of these immigrants aren't children dying, they aren't pregnant women, they're just people searching for a better life. But here's the problem. They're unable to get that. Why? According to, sorry, I lost my notes on this. Oh, yeah. According to Dr. Cheryl Bernard, she took a look at how immigrants were working in Germany's economics right now. And they admitted this week that 3/4 of the refugees Germany took in recently will still be unemployed in 5 years. That's 75% of these refugees coming in are unable to get a job. Why? Because these European countries have their own economic troubles. And when all of these different immigrants are coming in, they're unable to work and actually get those jobs. Now, I'm running out of time. During the next speech, I'll devote about 1.5 minutes to explaining the issues that have to do with crime. But the main thing we have to remember is that governments have a responsibility to their citizens first and the rest of the world second.
Okay. Well, the biggest issue that I have right now, first with your argument and your initial argument about helping the people of the country or the European people first and foremost, is that we have two different types of immigration that's occurring in Europe. Okay, you have intra-European immigration, you have inter-European immigration. You seem to be focusing on inter-European immigration, and in that regard. According to, let me see the website here, Open Society Foundation, which handles a lot of different migrant and refugee situations, that's of bases and such, actually about 2/3 of all inter-European immigrants are refugees that are seeking asylum. In 2015, they had approximately 27 million people enter Europe from war-torn areas. And right now they're seeing on a daily basis of around 11,000 or so. Most of these people are entering through Italy and Greece, mostly from Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Afghanistan. The biggest issue that you're talking about is not actually on migrants that are inter-European entries. These are not people coming from outside of Europe that are migrating through Europe. It's actually intra-European migrants. So while I understand your position, I think that there is a big misunderstanding of what's happening with jobs and the economic construction that exists within the whole of Europe. Many of the migrants that are entering are refugees. They are trying to get away from very bad situations. An estimated 6,000 people were killed crossing the Mediterranean, for example, just last summer. trying to escape the war in Syria and basically ISIS and a whole bunch of other social systems that are kind of harming them. If we're going to talk about economic processes and getting jobs, like in Germany, the 3 quarters that you discussed, most of those people that you're talking about are migrants that are refugees, that are asylum seeking, do not have training in English or in German, which are the 2 major languages in Germany. The reason why they aren't going to have a job by the end of the year or in the next 5 years is because they're still learning and becoming permanent citizens. So we have to consider many more factors, and you can't just say, oh, it's X or Y or Z. We have to take into account the whole structure of the European Union and how migration works within the system, both intrinsically and extrinsically. So I'll pass it back to you.
So your main point was talking about and intra-European immigration. So I have a couple things I want to say on this. The first is it doesn't matter. The resolution doesn't necessarily say refugees. It doesn't say where this immigration is coming from. It just says impose harder restrictions on immigration. So that can refer to intra-European or coming from outside. It's irrelevant. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the biggest positive thing I want to discuss here. Or not positive, but point I wasn't able to discuss in my next speech before I respond to what you said, which is my point of crime wave. Now, a lot of times when we talk about immigration, we think that different crimes that come from immigration are mere outlier issues. However, that's not true. Reuters reported that according to German police, migrants were linked to 69,000 crimes in months of 2016. Let's take a moment and just process that number for a second. In the country of Germany, 69,000 crimes in 3 months, all linked back to migrants. Now, the issue here is that they're accepting so many. Germany itself just accepting over about 1 million, I believe. They're accepting so many without the time able to process them and without the necessary restrictions needed to assimilate and get them into the culture. They're taking so many in, and because they don't speak the language, like he talked about, because they still haven't introduced police officers who are able to speak the language, those crime waves are increasing. But the biggest issue is that they're taking so many in, they aren't able to process them enough, aren't able to background check, aren't able to vet them, aren't able to teach them or assimilate them different ways. And so that's why 69,000 crimes are being committed in Germany in 3 months by migrants. And this isn't just a German problem. The Austrian police report that Afghan and Syrian migrants represent for 60% of sexual assault cases within their countries. The problem is, these people are coming in and they're not learning the values that Western democracy has. Values that say, hey, maybe we shouldn't sexually assault people on the street. Maybe we shouldn't hurt other people that are, and treat women and men equally. These different people aren't learning that because they're just being shoved into these nations faster and faster and faster before they're able to process them correctly. So that's one of the biggest reasons that Europe should impose harder restrictions. Going into a little bit of what my opponent talked about, we've already talked about why the intra and extra-European immigration isn't specifically important to this debate round, but onto his argument about how 6,000 people were killed coming to the Mediterranean entry, you can tag my response as turn because of immigration. The issue is because of such loose immigration laws, these people are coming and coming because they know that they don't have to have visas to get into Italy and to get into Greece. They know they can get through very easily. And so they're coming and they know that Europe will come in and they will try to rescue people crossing the Mediterranean. So more and more are dying because of it. So when we take a look at the issue, this is not only unfair to European states, it's also unfair to the refugees themselves because they're being promised a better world, but they aren't getting it.
Okay. Let me first point out crime. While any country that has an influx of immigrants of any form will see an increase in crime, and that's because we have a cross-cultural issue here. We have people that have different values interacting with each other, and what is considered a crime maybe in one country isn't a crime in another. And so we have to take that into account. But I think that you have actually overstepped a major issue here, and that is how inter-European immigration occurs with refugees. Many of these refugees are entering Europe because Europe has assimilated and taken into account the UN Civil Rights Accord. And the thing with this is that if you are an asylum seeker or a refugee, any European country is required to take you in, but because of a loose standard across 23 different countries as to how asylum seekers are processed we see a lot of throughput. That means a lot of migrants are entering through one country and then going to another and to another and to another until they reach a country that has established an asylum system that is actually capable of processing them. Both Greece and Italy, for example, Greece has an estimated 16,000 immigrants coming in to be processed, both migrants and refugees. 11,000 of which are refugees, but they're only processing around 8,000. Italy is only processing around 1,000, while they're taking in an estimated 8,000. Most of these people are leaving war-torn countries who have no other option. It's either they stay and die, or they leave. So, what's happening now is Germany has a very precise process to handle asylum seekers. So they're entering Germany to go through the asylum process because it is well established and it can actually handle a much higher load. Most of these people don't even want to stay in Germany. They're just being processed there before they're moving on to the countries where they have family, friends, and established life that they can go to. Whether or not this is actually helping or harming the citizens of Europe is questionable, because Germany, for example, has a negative birth rate. The influx of people coming in are actually adding to the workforce, which they've been having problems with since 2001. The same thing is true of France. And I would also point out that more importantly is that we have a mixture of both intra-European and inter-European migration that does actually matter here. We have a lot of movement within the EU, where you have people moving from places like Austria, Germany, France, Netherlands to other places to find jobs that they can work and are suited for. And those places are losing people and workers that they need. And so it's a much bigger and broader problem, and harsher laws aren't going to help.
Okay, so let's take a look at what my opponents just talked about. The biggest point I want to bring up here is, you can write down, if you're taking notes, as arguing for reform. My opponent just told us that whenever there's a large influx of refugees, we will see an increase in crime. And my opponent has also just said that whenever these refugees are coming in right now, because they, by EU rules, EU member states are required to accept these refugees and give them asylum, I believe. Is that correct? Not okay. And so he's saying that this is happening, but he doesn't dispute the problems with that. As I showed you, the problems are crime and economic. He doesn't dispute the fact that in 5 years, 3/4 of these refugees and these immigrants will still be unemployed in Germany. And that's the biggest issue here. Well, not the biggest, but it's one of the two. The other one is that over the first 3 months of 2016, 69,000 crimes were linked to migrants. In Austria, 60% of sexual assaults were caused by Afghan and Syrian migrants. This is the issue here, is these people aren't coming in and being processed well. And so what we see here is that these people, sure, what's going on back home might not be great for them, but they're coming here. And what's happening is Europe is neglecting the responsibility they have to their citizens to A, employ them, and B, keep them safe. Germany can't even employ its own citizens right now, let alone employ hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants coming in. As we can see by the data, they aren't getting jobs and they are remaining unemployed. And so if we look at what the resolution asks my side to prove, that Europe should impose harder restrictions on immigration, I provided you 2 reasons why. One of which is the large amount of crime. The second is the economic failure of the current immigration system. My opponent has essentially agreed that these are problems, but hasn't offered any positive reasons for why we should not reform the immigration system. I'd be interested to hear what some of those are.
Well, the first thing is that I don't want harder restrictions. Yes, reform needs to happen. Don't get me wrong. There is very much in the way of space and need for reform. We need to reform how asylum seekers are actually processed, especially in countries of entry. But harder restrictions are not going to actually solve the problem. The biggest issue that you're seeing right now is backlash. And that's what you were actually describing, is backlash. When we look at the entry countries like Greece and Italy, what happens is we get this backlog of asylum seekers who are basically stuck in Italy or Germany, who are being either sent back from places like Germany and France, who don't want to handle their asylum, sending them back to Italy and Greece, and they get stuck in these very harsh living conditions. And so the backlash that you're seeing are these crimes. These are people basically attacking the people that they're trying to get help from because they are feeling stuck and in between and left behind. We're talking about concentration camps, essentially. These are places where people are stuck. They don't have really good living conditions. They don't have a lot of food. They don't have access to the things that they need to live. Most of the crimes that you're describing, like the sexual assaults or the thefts and all these crimes that you are discussing, that's just cultural backlash. Uh, what you're arguing essentially is that we need to have Europe take care of their citizens, and that's perfectly understandable. But on the flip side, a lot of your points are missing the greater picture. And the greater picture is we have a lot of people who are coming into Europe, having a life that's been torn apart because of war and other issues, and they're trying to make a better life for themselves. And instead, they're being herded into little places, and they can't do what they need to do. Do we need reform? Yes. Harsher entry? No. The rules that govern entry into Europe beyond migration and refugees specifically seeking asylum are extremely stringent. So, I mean, for me, if I wanted to go and live in Europe, I would have to get a visa, prove that I have 1.5 times the amount of times the average amount to stay there for the average amount that's earned for people there. There's just a lot more to the problem. You have brought up a lot of good points, a lot of problems that exist, but that they don't actually address the underlying issues. You're talking about symptoms and thinking that these need to be fixed when they aren't the symptoms at all. It's not the actual cause. The cause is the problems that exist underlying it, and the drive behind the migration. So we have to find ways to work around that. Do you understand?
I've got a couple questions for you because I'm a little bit confused about something. So you said that current restrictions on immigration are stringent, but before you said that EU member states were forced to accept refugees and asylum seekers. So are they stringent, or are EU countries forced to accept any refugees or asylum seekers?
Well, they are very stringent for a person who's seeking citizenship, who wants to move there, who wants to be to work there or become a student. The normal migrant, if you will, the average immigrant. When it comes to refugees and people seeking asylum, the rules are different. A person who's seeking asylum has to be bona fide fleeing from a place that could cause them bodily harm, death, or is disenfranchising them. And when they have that set up, the UN's laws and the Human Rights Accord guarantees that these people have an ability to seek asylum, to stay as a resident, temporary resident in a country in Europe, and then to seek full citizenship once they meet the requirements. They are actually still under threat of being deported or even being sent back once the conflicts that they're fleeing are resolved. So we have kind of a duality in how citizenship exists for migrants, especially refugees, and especially those fleeing from Syria and Afghanistan, whatever else. We have to still consider the fact, though, that European standards for becoming an immigrant, a permanent citizen, are extremely stringent. Most of these people are not going to experience that. They're going there temporarily, and then they'll be sent back or given the option to become full citizens, in which case they have to go through the same process that anybody else would have to go through, and it is extremely difficult.
Okay. I want to make clear what my argument is. My argument is that it should be harder for people to get into Europe, period, to immigrate into Europe at all. So what I'm not saying is, or well, what I'm saying essentially is that these refugees, these asylum seekers, or any other migrant or immigrant, Europe should increase the restrictions for anyone trying to enter their country. And that refers to all kinds of immigration, period. And so when we talk about how with refugee seekers trying to immigrate to Europe and how that causes all these huge problems, or what you call cultural backlash, those are the problems I'm trying to solve. And so when we look, my opponent says that I'm only looking at the symptom of the issue, but let's go ahead and take a look at the root cause of the issue. The root cause is massive influx of immigrants coming in. The root cause is the fact that millions upon millions upon millions of immigrants are surging into Europe from these countries, and they're not able to be processed well. They're not able to assimilate. They're not able to be taught. And so, yes, of course, there is cultural backlash that has resulted in 69,000 crimes being attributed to migrants in Germany in the first 3 months of 2016. It's resulted in 60% of all sexual assault cases in Austria coming from Syrian and Afghan migrants. It's resulted in these immigrants, 75% of them being unable to get a job in the place where they wanted opportunity for the next 5 years. That's a result from the root cause being the massive influx of immigrants coming in. So when I say we should impose harder restrictions, I think we should restrict the amount of immigrants coming into Europe, so that way Europe can take care of its own citizens first and make sure they're able to get a job and keep them safe before they decide to make all these other people new citizens or just even let them into the country at all. Let's remember that immigration includes just legal immigration and illegal immigration. I'm saying we should impose restrictions on both kinds of immigration and make sure that European citizens are foremost.
Okay. The thing is, none of that is the root cause. Those are all symptoms, and I think you're missing that. The root cause for the migration, the root cause for people to be leaving, is situations which endanger their lives, disenfranchise them. These people that are entering, the millions upon millions, the 26 million people since 2015 that have entered Europe, have done so because they're being killed, slaughtered, forcibly put into slave labor. These are people that are being told that either they join ISIS or they die. Their homes have been destroyed, their farms have been destroyed, they have no resources available to them. These people are leaving because they have a need to. And the reason why the UN Human Rights Accord exists is to ensure that all people's rights are guaranteed, and the European Union has agreed to that accord. That's why they have a responsibility to help those who are in need. Everything else beyond that, those are symptoms, and those are symptoms that can be addressed, but they aren't going to be addressed by harsher or harder criterion to enter into the country. All you would see is a greater influx of people entering these countries illegally rather than going through asylum seeking processes legally. And which would be worse, having undocumented immigrants entering the different countries who don't have visas, don't have passports, don't have access to documentation to say who they are, where they're from, and so they end up clogging up prisons and the like, or having a system in place for asylum seekers who are capable, which is capable of handling the massive influx of people. All you would see is more illegal immigration because these people have nowhere else to go. The reality of the situation is that we can't have harsher and harder immigration laws. What we need is more efficient laws, more specific laws, and implementation. I can't talk today. The application of those laws and getting people processed and then being placed so that they can get jobs, so they can learn, so they can assimilate. That's the biggest issue right now. The very root cause is these people are being displaced. And they're being displaced by war and basically terrorism within their own countries. People that are being forced to fight for things they don't want to fight for. An estimated 36% of the people that are coming in from Syria and Afghanistan aren't even Islamic, for example. They're actually Christians. They're people fleeing these countries because of being persecuted. We have to consider all of these factors, and harder laws are just not going to help the situation.
All right, so my opponent says that we need to focus on reforms and not focus on harder restrictions. Now, I want to make sure we don't get lost in the sort of heartwarming rhetoric that he's engaged in, because what's happening is, yes, there is absolutely a humanitarian crisis. The Middle East is exploding. Africa is having civil wars left and right. It's a big issue. However, there's not much that Europe can do about it. Europe can't go in and say, hey, Africa, we solved your civil war. Or, hey, Syria, we've solved your civil war. They can't fix these issues. All Europe can do is create harder restrictions and allow for a more manageable amount of immigrants into their country. So when my opponent tells you that the root cause is the problems happening in the Middle East and Africa, let's remember that we're not discussing what the root cause of the refugee crisis is. The root cause of Europe's current problem is the massive influx of immigrants. And yes, of course, if we go deeper and deeper and deeper, the root cause of the massive influx of immigrants is the civil wars. And the root cause of those massive civil wars can be traced back millennia to all sorts of different things. But let's focus on the root causes we can solve. And the root cause we can solve is the massive number of immigrants coming in. My opponent has asserted that, well, they'll still be able to get in somehow. But that's just simply not true. Countries impose quotas on the amount of immigrants they receive all the time. And they actually have work all the time, and they're able to do it well. And yeah, he's laughing right now, but let's remember that he hasn't asserted any proof that this wouldn't work at all, and that wouldn't. And so let's just talk about whether these harder restrictions, etc. Let's remember what his side is. His side is saying, yeah, we need reform. We need to make the process more efficient. But the only way to do that is to lower the amount of people coming in. It's impossible to process 5 million. It's just not possible. Europe doesn't have the resources to do it. And we see that happening right now. Until we can see something that says, hey, this is a way more efficient way of going about it, the only way we have to go about it is to lower the amount of people coming in. That's the root cause of the issue. The core issue is numbers. There are millions upon millions of people entering Europe. 69,000 crimes in Germany in 3 months linked to migrants. 75% of them unable to get a job. 60% of Austrian sexual assaults are coming from migrants. These people do need to be processed better, and it's impossible to do that when they're coming in at such large numbers. So my opponent says they need to be more efficient. The only way to get a more efficient immigration policy is to lower the numbers. There's no other way to make it more efficient. You can't efficiently process a large number of people. Sorry if you can't hear me from like this truck coming by, but you can't efficiently do that. The best way to do it is to impose harder restrictions, and there's no alternative.
You're wrong on several facts. One, we can process millions of people efficiently. We have the technology and the capability. It's just that these countries have their own loose laws that do not pertain to the standard that exists under the CEAS standards. So they aren't actually doing it in a very efficient way. As soon as we change it to a universal standard for all the countries, instead of having these hodgepodge systems set around throughout Europe, throughout the EU, we can easily process all the people that are coming in. Two, illegal immigration. There are hundreds of thousands of different routes that illegal immigrants come into Europe from the Middle East, from Greece, through the Mediterranean. There's many, and they just become undocumented, and that becomes even a bigger problem. We see the same problem here in the United States. A lot of illegal immigrants coming in, and it's instead of processing them and allowing for asylum, you're just going to see bigger and more pertinent problems. The point is that you talk about crimes, you talk about the 69,000 linked crimes in Germany, you talk about the sexual assaults, you talk about all these things, but in the grand scheme of things, while these are going to happen, they're going to happen regardless of the immigrants or not. Austria has seen in the past booms in sexual assault depending on cultural norms, and that shifts all the time. So we need to look at the root cause of the problems that exist, and we need to make the process more efficient, not harder.
Okay, let's take a look at the last thing my opponent said, which is that these problems are going to happen regardless of the immigrants or not. Let's remember that what's happening right now is that 69,000 crimes are being caused by immigrants that aren't being processed efficiently enough because of these high numbers. Let's remember right now that 60% of sexual assaults in Austria are happening right now because of immigrants coming in at high numbers, and they're not able to be vetted, they're not able to be processed. We're not saying we should halt all immigration. We're just saying take it in at a lower level, something that's manageable. That's all the pro team is arguing, to make it manageable and assure the responsibility to the European citizens and lower that level. So he says it's going to happen regardless. And let's talk about the root causes he's talking about. Each one of these are telling the root cause: 60% of sexual assaults in Austria, 69,000 crimes in Germany in the first 3 months, 75% of them unemployed, are happening because of the immigrants coming in at high numbers. So we move the numbers down. That allows the systems to process them efficiently. He says we have the technology and the capability to do it right now. Well, why aren't they? The problem, he says because the laws are loose. Yeah, I'm saying we should make the laws tighter. We should restrict those laws. And that's the biggest issue here. The laws need to be tighter in order to restrict the amount of immigrants coming in. The biggest root cause is the high amount of immigrants. And that's what we have to analyze here. There are millions and millions of immigrants coming in, and the governments are unable to process them efficiently, unable to vet them, and unable to help and teach them and assimilate them. The only way to solve these problems